Hey viewers! Hope you're all doing great. Before I start the story, tell me in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you enjoy my videos, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Imagine you are standing in the dim glow of an early Roman dawn. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica hum faintly through the mist, and a faint breeze carries the scent of incense from the Vatican gardens. The sound seems peaceful, but somewhere beneath that stillness, something far more complex is unfolding. You see, there was once a time when the Pope was not only the spiritual father of millions, but also one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. He didn't just bless kings, he commanded them. He owned armies, collected taxes, and ruled over a vast realm known as the Papal States. It's a strange thought, isn't it? The same gentle figure dressed in white robes, blessing the faithful from the balcony, was once a sovereign, an earthly monarch, whose territory covered nearly half of Italy. Yet this is no myth. For more than 1,000 years, from the 8th century until the late 19th, the Pope ruled over a patchwork of lands stretching from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic. From the bustling streets of Bologna to the quiet valleys of Umbria, from Ravenna's faded mosaics to the fortified walls of Ancona, the papal banner flew high. But how did it begin? To understand that, we must travel back to a time when Rome had fallen, when emperors no longer guarded her walls, and when chaos crept through the peninsula like ivy over forgotten stone. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed, and Italy became a mosaic of invaders: Goths, Lombards, and Franks. Amid that confusion, one figure remained steady: the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. At first, he was merely a spiritual shepherd. But as emperors disappeared and armies marched through the streets, the people of Rome turned to the Church, not for prayers alone, but for protection, for order, for leadership. The Pope's role slowly changed. From a preacher to a negotiator, from a negotiator to a ruler. The transformation began with a man named Pope Stephen II. Around the year 754, he made a journey north, across the Alps, to meet a Frankish king, Pepin the Short, father of Charlemagne. The Lombards had threatened Rome, and the Byzantine Empire, once its protector, had grown distant and weak. So Stephen turned to the Franks for help. What happened next would shape Italy for centuries. Pepin agreed to defend the Pope's territories. In return, the Pope would crown Pepin as the rightful king of the Franks, a divine blessing that no earthly ruler could resist. And in that sacred trade, power for legitimacy, the foundations of the Papal States were born. When the Lombards were defeated, Pepin made what came to be known as the donation of Pepin. It was not gold or jewels that he gave, but land, vast tracts of central Italy. The cities of Ravenna, Perugia, and much of Emilia-Romagna were handed to the Pope, in perpetuity. Imagine the scene. The air cool and heavy with incense. The Pope standing in his white robes, the Frankish soldiers kneeling before him, their swords laid flat on the earth. A scroll is unrolled, a map perhaps, and for the first time the Church's realm is marked not in scripture, but in soil. Rome, once the seat of emperors, now belonged to a priest. The Papal States expanded and shifted over the centuries. Some lands were lost to war, others regained through careful diplomacy. But for nearly 1,100 years, these territories remained under the direct rule of the Church. From the outside it looked holy, but within those marble halls and candlelit chambers, the story was rarely simple. The popes were not always saints. Some were warriors, some were bankers, some were even politicians cloaked in sanctity. Yet somehow their rule endured. Picture the borders. A sprawling, uneven body of land that cut through the heart of Italy. The Papal States were surrounded by rival powers: the Duchy of Tuscany, the Kingdom of Naples, and later, the restless city-states like Venice and Milan. The Pope's lands acted as a kind of barrier between northern and southern Italy. Travelers moving from Florence to Naples had to pass through papal customs. Taxes were collected, treaties signed. Merchants prayed their wagons would not be stopped by papal guards. The cities within the states were like pearls, each with its own story. Bologna, a center of learning, where students debated philosophy under the Church's watch. Ferrara, graceful and proud, where art flourished even under papal shadow, or Urbino, hidden in its hills, where painters and thinkers whispered of human freedom even as the papal banners waved. But the strangest part of it all was how delicate it looked on a map. The Papal States were not a single solid country. They were a patchwork, a jigsaw of lands connected by fragile corridors and ancient roads. A strange frontier of faith and politics intertwined. And it is here, amid this delicate geography, that the most curious stories unfolded. Tales of cities that vanished under papal decrees, of dukes who woke up to find their castles surrounded by church soldiers, and of peasants who never truly knew whether they lived under heaven or under Rome. As centuries passed, the Papal States became a paradox, a realm that claimed divine authority, yet functioned as any other kingdom. A ruler who wore a crown not of gold, but of thorns, and still commanded armies and collected taxes. And through it all, the popes walked a narrow path between heaven and earth. But something else was coming. Something that would test the church's hold not only over souls, but over land, money, and power itself. It began quietly, with whispers of revolution, and a longing for Italy. Not papal, not imperial, but united. The question would soon arise, quietly at first, then thunderously through the streets of Rome. Could there truly be one Italy, while the Pope owned half of it? The question echoed through centuries like a trembling note beneath the choir's song. Could there be one Italy, while the Pope ruled as king? The Papal States were a world of contradictions. In the marble halls of the Vatican, cardinals debated salvation and sin. But outside those gates, in the streets of Perugia or Ancona, taxes were collected, soldiers marched, and roads were patrolled by papal guards. For the ordinary people it was not heaven, it was a government. Papal officials issued documents, levied duties on salt and grain, inspected roads, and demanded loyalty. Priests blessed the fields in springtime, but behind those blessings lay administrative ledgers and sealed parchments. And yet, unlike other kingdoms, this one claimed divine right not from bloodlines, but from faith. The Pope, it was said, was Christ's vicar on earth. To oppose him was to oppose God himself. That belief, more than any army, kept the Papal States alive for centuries. But Italy was changing. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the peninsula had become a tapestry of powers. Venice ruled the seas, Florence thrived on commerce, Milan grew rich from industry and ambition. The Papal States, caught in the middle, found themselves both respected and resented. Some cities under papal control began to rebel. Bologna, for instance, slipped in and out of papal hands more than once. The people there often preferred local independence to the heavy hand of Rome. Perugia too was restless, its citizens proud and unwilling to bow easily. In some eras popes ruled firmly. In others their control waned, and local families took charge. Lords, dukes, and condottieri who governed in the pope's name but kept most power for themselves. You can imagine it. The Pope in Rome signing decrees in Latin while, hundreds of miles away, a warlord in Ferrara or a noble in Rimini enforced only the rules that pleased him. The Papal States stretched like a thin thread over turbulent ground. Still, the illusion of papal control persisted. Then came the Avignon papacy, one of the strangest chapters in church history. In 1309, Pope Clement V, a Frenchman, moved the papal seat from Rome to Avignon in southern France. For nearly 70 years, the popes lived there, far from the eternal city. Without their presence, Rome decayed. Grass grew in the forum. Wolves roamed the streets at night. The Roman people, once subjects of a powerful theocratic ruler, were left under local chaos. But even from Avignon, the popes continued to govern their Italian lands through legates and administrators. They sent troops, collected taxes, and kept their claim to power alive. When finally, in 1377, Pope Gregory XI returned to Rome, he found a city in ruins, beautiful but broken, and a state barely holding together. Yet the return marked more than geography. It symbolized rebirth. The Church would once again take firm hold over its territories. However, this rebirth was accompanied by blood. During the Renaissance, as Italy's city-states bloomed into centers of art, wealth, and knowledge, the Papal States also became deeply entangled in worldly affairs. Popes like Julius II and Alexander VI are remembered not for spiritual peace, but for war and politics. Pope Julius II, known as the Warrior Pope, donned armor and personally led troops into battle. His dream was to restore the Papal States' borders and bring rebellious cities back under church control. He succeeded, but at a cost: thousands of lives, and the uneasy sight of God's representative wielding a sword. Under him, Bologna was recaptured, Perugia subdued, and the papal army marched through Umbria like a tide of holy iron. Then came the Borgias. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, was one of the most infamous of all. His reign from 1492 to 1503 was soaked in intrigue, alliances, and betrayal. His son, Cesare Borgia, became the general of the papal army and carved out a state within a state. Machiavelli himself would later model The Prince, partly on Cesari's ruthless ambition. The Papal States during this period were magnificent yet dark, a kingdom of marble and murder. Artists painted angels on chapel ceilings while mercenaries fought below those same domes. Still, the Church's grip on central Italy remained solid. But while the Renaissance filled cities with beauty, it also filled minds with questions. The Reformation shook the Church's foundations. Wars of religion swept across Europe. Yet somehow, the Papal States endured, protected by geography, faith, and the old respect that still surrounded Rome. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the papal government became an intricate machine of bureaucracy. Cardinals acted as ministers, collecting reports from distant towns. The countryside was dotted with monasteries and small garrisons. Roads connected Rome to its cities like veins in a living body. Travelers described the region as serene but stagnant. While the rest of Europe industrialized and modernized, the Papal States remained a step behind. Gentle, pastoral, and slow-moving. Imagine walking through those lands in the 1700s. Quiet hills, olive groves shimmering in the sun, monasteries ringing their bells at dusk, and the faint smell of burning olive wood drifting from chimneys. But under that peace, a strange sense of stillness. An empire half frozen in time. The Papal States' wealth depended heavily on agriculture, and the Church controlled vast lands directly. Many peasants lived as tenants of monasteries or bishops. Taxes were strict, and reforms rare. Education, too, was closely tied to religious instruction. And yet, there was charm. Foreign visitors like Goethe and Stendhal, when traveling through Italy, described the papal countryside as ethereal, a place where time seemed slower, where every hill carried whispers of ancient Rome. Still something stirred in the shadows. Beyond the borders, in the courts of Piedmont and the cities of Lombardy, a new idea was rising: Italian unity. The dream of a single nation. It was fragile at first, a poet's hope, but soon became a political fire. The Papal States, lying in the very heart of the peninsula, stood in the way of that dream. If Italy was ever to be united, someone would have to challenge the Pope's sovereignty. It would not happen overnight. It would take revolutions, invasions, and iron resolve. But the first tremors were already there. In the streets, in secret clubs, in the writings of men like Mazzini, and in the determined eyes of a soldier named Garibaldi. The world was changing. The papal lands, once unshakable, now trembled on the edge of history. Somewhere in the Vatican, an aging pope would look out over Rome's rooftops and feel it too, the faint, inevitable pull of a new age coming closer. And he must have wondered, quietly, as candles flickered in the corridors of St. Peter's, how long can one man own half of Italy, before Italy decides to take itself back? The dawn of the 19th century came softly to the hills of central Italy. The olive trees still shimmered in morning dew, and monks still walked along the cloisters whispering their prayers. But beneath that stillness, the world was shifting. Empires were falling. Revolutions were spreading like wildfire. And soon, even the Papal States, the timeless realm of faith and ritual, would feel the tremors of change. When Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power in France, His ambition reached beyond borders and thrones. He saw Europe as a chessboard, and the Papal States were a piece he could not ignore. The Pope still held immense spiritual influence, and his territories occupied the center of the Italian peninsula, a position too strategic to overlook. In 1796, Napoleon's armies marched into northern Italy, defeating the Austrians and reshaping borders. The Papal States were next. Pope Pius VI, an aging and cautious man, hoped diplomacy could protect him. But Napoleon was not a man of patience. The French demanded the Pope renounce his claims over certain cities, deliver precious artworks, and accept revolutionary reforms. For a time the Pope yielded. But when he resisted further, when he refused to recognize the new French-controlled republics, Napoleon struck. In 1798, French troops entered Rome. They proclaimed the Roman Republic, abolished the Pope's temporal authority, and seized papal treasures. Pius VI was taken prisoner and sent away from Rome, first to Siena, then to Florence, and finally across the Alps to Valence, in France, where he died in captivity. It was the first time in centuries that the papal throne had been emptied by force. Rome, the eternal city, was silent. The Papal States, once vast and confident, were broken apart. But history has its cycles. After Napoleon's downfall in 1814, the Congress of Vienna sought to restore the old order. The diplomats of Europe, Metternich of Austria, Castlereagh of Britain, Talleyrand of France, gathered to redraw the map of the continent. And among their many decisions, one stood out. The Papal States must be restored. So it was done. The papal banners were raised again over Rome, Bologna, and Ancona. Pope Pius VII, who had also been imprisoned by Napoleon, returned to a city scarred but faithful. The Church reclaimed its lands, but something essential had changed. The world no longer believed in divine right the way it once had. New ideas, liberty, nationalism, self-determination, were spreading like morning light across Europe. To many Italians, the Papal States now seemed like an obstacle from another age, an old wall standing between them and the dream of a single Italy. Still, the Vatican resisted. The popes believed their temporal rule was not mere politics, but a sacred trust, a legacy of St. Peter himself. To surrender it would be to betray centuries of faith. In 1831, rebellion came again. In the cities of Bologna, Ferrara, and Ancona, uprisings broke out demanding liberal constitutions and local autonomy. The papal army, aided by Austrian troops, crushed them. But the seeds were planted. Each rebellion, each pamphlet, each whisper of freedom, chipped away at the idea that the Pope could forever be a king. As the century advanced, a young generation of Italians grew restless. They read Mazzini's calls for unity. They admired the courage of Garibaldi's red-shirt volunteers, and they dreamed of a nation free from foreign rule and from papal politics. But in Rome, within the frescoed corridors of the Vatican, the air remained solemn and slow. The Pope at that time, Pius IX, was a gentle and pious man. At first he was seen as a reformer. When he took the throne in 1846, he introduced modest changes: amnesty for political prisoners, a civic guard, and even talk of a constitution. People rejoiced. In the streets of Rome, crowds chanted his name. Viva Pio Nono! They saw him as a man who might bridge faith and freedom. But history turned sharply. When revolution swept Europe in 1848, even Rome was caught in the storm. Nationalists and Republicans demanded that the Pope join the fight for Italian independence. But Pius IX hesitated. To him, joining a war against Catholic Austria meant bloodshed among fellow believers. People grew angry. The streets of Rome filled with protest. Then violence erupted. The Pope's prime minister, Count Rossi, was assassinated on the steps of the Palazzo della Cancelleria. Fearing for his safety, Pius IX fled the city disguised as an ordinary priest, escaping to Gaeta, a small coastal town under the protection of the Kingdom of Naples. For a brief, dazzling moment, Rome became the Roman Republic once again. Led by men like Giuseppe Mazzini, the city declared freedom, democracy, and unity. Ancient ideals were revived. New hopes were born, but the dream was short-lived. French troops, sent by Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the future Napoleon III, besieged Rome in 1849. After fierce fighting, the Republic fell. The Pope returned, guarded by French bayonets, and the Papal States were restored once more. Yet even as the Pope re-entered his capital, his power felt different, restored by foreign soldiers, not by faith or loyalty. The world had changed. In the years that followed, the Papal States became an island of the Old World amid a sea of modern nations. The popes ruled with care but caution. Roads were repaired, schools maintained, taxes levied, but the people's hearts were drifting elsewhere, toward the idea of Italia Unita, one Italy. And in the north, a new power was rising. The Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia, under King Victor Emmanuel II and his Prime Minister Count Cavour, was uniting the northern regions under one crown. Step by step, the dream of Italy was becoming real. In 1859, war broke out between France, Sardinia, and Austria. The map shifted again. Lombardy was freed. Then Tuscany, Modena, and Parma joined the new kingdom. By 1860, Garibaldi's volunteers marched through the south, conquering Sicily and Naples. The Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed in 1861. But in the center of the map, like a stubborn island, the Papal States still stood, dividing north and south. The Pope refused to yield. He declared himself the temporal ruler by divine right, and foreign powers, especially France, still supported him. French troops remained in Rome to protect him from Italian nationalists. Yet everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The Papal States were surrounded. Italy had united almost completely, except for the lands of the Pope. And so, the question that had whispered through centuries returned. No longer a distant thought, but a demand. How long could the Holy Father keep his earthly crown? When an entire nation now dreamed of one flag, one capital, one Italy, the answer was approaching. It would arrive not with ceremony or blessing, but with the echo of marching boots, and the quiet surrender of a city that had once ruled the world. The year was 1870. The morning sun rose over the domes of Rome, touching the marble statues with gold. The streets were quiet, almost reverent. Yet beneath that calm, the final act of a 1,000-year story was about to unfold. The Papal States, those ancient lands that had stretched across half of Italy, were shrinking, trembling, waiting. Only the city of Rome and a few surrounding provinces remained under papal rule. The rest had already joined the newborn Kingdom of Italy. King Victor Emmanuel II watched from the north, his mind set on completing the dream. He knew that Italy could not truly exist while Rome remained a separate, papal kingdom in the center of its heart. And in Rome, Pope Pius IX, old now, fragile yet defiant, refused to surrender his divine claim. For centuries, popes had spoken as rulers. But Pius IX faced a new kind of challenge. A nation united not by faith, but by identity. The Italians no longer looked to Rome as the head of the church. They saw it as their capital, their inheritance, their destiny. Still the Pope stood firm. He declared that his spiritual authority and his temporal power were inseparable. To yield his land, he believed, would be to betray God himself. But destiny cares little for declarations. In September of 1870, as the Franco-Prussian War raged in Europe, the French garrison that had long protected the Pope was withdrawn. For the first time in years, Rome stood without foreign soldiers at its gates. The Italian army, led by General Raffaele Cadorna, saw its moment. Quietly, efficiently, the troops moved south toward the Eternal City. They carried not hatred, but a mission, to unite what history had divided. When they reached the Aurelian walls that surrounded Rome, they sent a message to the Pope: surrender peacefully, and the city would be spared. Pius IX refused. He ordered the small papal army, just a few thousand men, to defend the city. They were brave, loyal, and hopelessly outnumbered. At dawn on September 20, 1870, the Italian artillery opened fire on the walls near Porta Pia. The thunder of the cannons echoed across the ancient ruins, shaking dust from the Colosseum's arches. Within hours, a breach appeared. Italian troops entered the city. The battle lasted barely 3 hours. When the smoke cleared, the white flag was raised above the Vatican's towers. Rome had fallen, not to conquerors but to her own people. The Pope withdrew within the Leonine walls, the small enclave that contained St. Peter's Basilica and the Vatican Palace. He declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican, refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the new Italian kingdom. Outside, the streets filled with quiet awe. There was no celebration, no cruelty, only the weight of history settling into place. After more than 11 centuries, the Papal States were gone. The soldiers who had entered the city walked softly, their boots echoing on the cobblestones of an empire that had outlived empires. They lowered their flags in respect as they passed St. Peter's Square, where the Pope remained unseen behind heavy curtains. In Parliament, King Victor Emmanuel II was declared King of Italy, Roma Capitale. Rome, at last, was the capital of a united nation. But the question of the Pope's position lingered painfully unresolved. For the next 60 years, popes would remain inside the Vatican, refusing to step outside or acknowledge the Italian state. They communicated through encyclicals and letters, maintaining their claim to sovereignty while physically confined to a few acres of sacred ground. The Italian government, meanwhile, respected the Pope's spiritual role but insisted that Rome belonged to the people. A quiet standoff began, a frozen war between throne and altar, between the ancient and the modern. Imagine it. The Vatican gardens blooming behind closed gates, the sound of church bells echoing across a city that no longer belonged to the church. Pilgrims still came, kneeling before St. Peter's tomb, but they now walked through the streets of Italy, not the Papal States. Decades passed. The world changed again. New technologies arrived. Trains, telegraphs, telephones. Nations rose and fell. The Church endured, yet its earthly crown had vanished. In the early 20th century, Italy itself transformed under new rulers and ideologies. Governments rose that were no longer guided by divine right, but by human ambition. The tension between church and state deepened, until at last it was resolved in an unexpected way. It was the year 1929 when Pope Pius XI and the Italian leader Benito Mussolini met to settle what history had left undone. The result was the Lateran Treaty, signed on February 11th in the Apostolic Palace. By that agreement, the Vatican City was recognized as an independent sovereign state. Tiny, only 44 hectares, but legally separate from Italy. The Pope renounced claims to the old Papal States and accepted the new Italian borders. In return, the Italian government recognized the independence and sanctity of the Vatican, granting it full diplomatic rights. The treaty brought peace, but also closure. The age of the Papal States, the age when the Pope ruled half of Italy, was officially over. From that day onward, the Pope ruled only a few city blocks of Rome, yet his voice reached across the world. The Church had lost its armies and provinces, but regained something deeper. Spiritual freedom, unchained from political power. Still, the memory of that vast kingdom lingers quietly in the stones of Italy, in Bologna's ancient walls, in Ferrara's faded frescoes, in the silent fortresses of Umbria, where once the papal banners fluttered in the wind. If you walk those roads today, you can still sense it, the ghost of a country within a country, the echo of bells that once called both to prayer and to power. And in the soft Roman dusk, as light fades over the Tiber and the domes begin to glow, it is easy to imagine that long-vanished time, when the Pope's shadow stretched from sea to sea, and the heart of faith beat as the heart of a nation. Now, in the quiet of evening, the story settles, like dust over ancient marble. But something remains unresolved, something that even treaties and centuries cannot silence. Because deep within history's whisper lies a question that still stirs softly in the Vatican's stone corridors. When faith once ruled as a kingdom, can it ever truly forget the feel of a crown? The dust of centuries had settled, but Rome was never truly quiet. Even after the cannons fell silent, even after the banners changed, something in the air of that ancient city still carried the echo of power. Soft, invisible, but present. When the Papal States vanished in 1870, they left behind more than lost borders. They left behind a memory of how faith and politics once shared the same throne. Now Rome belonged to the Italian nation, but within her heart, another realm endured, the Vatican, the smallest state on earth yet somehow the most extraordinary. Imagine the scene in the early years after unification. The Vatican walls stood still, their great gates closed. Outside them, the streets of Rome bustled with new life. Trams rattling, markets alive, modern voices rising where once Latin prayers had filled the air. Inside, however, time seemed slower. Pope Pius IX, refusing to recognize Italy's claim over Rome, withdrew completely into the Vatican. He declared himself a prisoner in his own house. No pope would leave those walls again for more than half a century. It became a city of silence. The papal palace glowed by candlelight, corridors long and echoing, its marble floors cold beneath the sandals of cardinals. They continued their rituals, prayers, meetings, the quiet hum of diplomacy, but never beyond those gates. And the people of Rome. They looked up at the Vatican's dome, wondering what the Holy Father thought as the world beyond changed faster than ever before. The late 19th century was an age of transformation. Italy built railways, industries, and universities. The government in Rome grew stronger. Yet the question of the Pope's role remained delicate, unspoken, unresolved. For decades, the Vatican and the Italian state existed side by side. Two nations within one city, separated not by walls alone, but by belief. Visitors wrote of the strange tension. A traveler could stand in St. Peter's Square and see both worlds at once. On one side, the uniformed guards of the Pope. On the other, the soldiers of the Italian king. Even the ringing of the bells carried two meanings. One for faith, one for state. And yet, there was calm in that balance. Pope Leo XIII, who succeeded Pius IX in 1878, was the first to open a small window to the outside world. Though he remained within the Vatican, his words reached far beyond it. His encyclicals spoke of labor, justice, and the rights of workers in a changing industrial world. The Church, though confined, was awakening to modernity. The Pope no longer needed to command armies. He could command hearts and minds instead. The Papal States were gone, but the idea of spiritual sovereignty had only grown stronger. Through the early 20th century, popes like Pius X and Benedict XV continued to shape global thought. When the First World War erupted, the Vatican declared neutrality, offering itself as a voice of peace. Yet even then, its peculiar status remained uncertain. Italy controlled Rome but not the Vatican. The Pope ruled the Church, but not the land beyond his gates. Two nations, one city, still waiting for peace. Then came 1929. The day the Lateran Treaty was signed, Rome stood in an awed silence. It was a February morning, cold and bright. Inside the Apostolic Palace, Italian officials in dark suits sat across from Vatican diplomats in flowing robes. Between them, two men who could not have been more different. Pope Pius XI, austere and intellectual, and Benito Mussolini, bold and worldly. Yet that day they found common ground. The treaty settled what centuries could not. The Vatican was declared a sovereign state. Tiny, yes, but independent. The Pope was recognized as head of this new entity, and Catholicism was acknowledged as Italy's state religion. In return, the Church accepted the reality of the Italian kingdom. The paper was signed, the seals pressed. 1,000 years of territorial tension ended in the quiet scratch of pens across parchment. And for the first time in generations, the Pope's gaze could reach beyond those walls without anger or fear. It was an ending, but also a rebirth. The Vatican City, though small, became a powerful symbol, a moral voice among nations. The Pope no longer owned half of Italy, yet the reach of his influence extended far beyond any map. From those few square blocks rose messages that would touch continents. When Europe descended once more into darkness during the Second World War, the Vatican stood as a place of refuge and negotiation. Within its walls, Jews, diplomats, and refugees found safety. Outside, Rome suffered occupation, bombing, and hunger, but the dome of St. Peter still shone each night like a promise. After the war, popes like Pius XII and John XI guided the Church into a new world. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s opened doors that had been closed for centuries, reaching across faiths, embracing dialogue, and seeking harmony in a fractured age. The Vatican no longer ruled by law or sword, but by conscience. Its power was invisible, yet immense. Still, somewhere in the Italian hills, old ruins whispered of what had been. In the abandoned fortresses of Umbria, vines climbed over papal coats of arms. In the dusty archives of Bologna, maps still showed faded borders marked with the crossed keys of St. Peter. And in the quiet towns once ruled by papal governors, old families still remembered stories. Of taxes paid to Rome, of decrees written in Latin, of processions that mixed politics with prayer. The memory of the Papal States remains like a dream, one part sacred, one part worldly. A time when priests were princes, when cathedrals served as castles, and when a man in white robes ruled both souls and cities. And though the marble has cracked and the crowns have faded, that strange age still lingers, in the rhythm of bells, in the art, in the names of streets, in the way Romans still glance toward the dome at sunset as if expecting something more than stone. 'Cause Rome is not just a city, it is memory itself. Layer upon layer, empire, republic, church, kingdom, all folded into one heartbeat of time. And when you stand in St. Peter's Square today, as the evening light glows gold across the colonnade, it's easy to forget where one history ends and another begins. Somewhere between faith and empire, between the earthly and the eternal, lies that vanished kingdom, the Papal States, whose shadow still touches every stone even now. Imagine walking through Italy today, through the small towns of Central Hills, the ones tourists rarely find. The air smells of olive trees and warm stone. The bells still ring on the hour, echoing across the valleys. If you pause long enough, you might feel it, that faint vibration in the ground, like a ghost of history beneath your feet. Because here, long before there was a united Italy, there was the Pope's Italy. Let's go back, slowly, quietly, to before the fall, to the age when the Papal States were still alive, when the Pope's banners fluttered above the hills of Lazio, Umbria, and the Marche. It is the 18th century. The world beyond these walls is changing fast. Revolutions in France, new ideas in America, but here the old ways still hold. The Papal States are a patchwork of the sacred and the ordinary. Every road begins and ends with the church. In the towns, local governors rule in the Pope's name. They wear black robes, gold seals, and carry the weight of heaven's authority, at least in theory. But in practice, it's a strange mixture. In one town, you might find a bishop concerned more with art than souls, commissioning frescoes of angels to decorate his palace. In another, a cardinal obsessed with law and order, sending clerks to chase bandits in the mountains. And in between them, peasants working the fields, whispering prayers to saints and hoping the next harvest would be kinder than the last. There were no clear borders here, only faith woven into the landscape. You could cross from papal territory into the Duchy of Tuscany or the Kingdom of Naples without realizing it, until you reached a checkpoint where guards in white and red livery would ask for your papers, seal them with the keys of St. Peter, and wish you a safe journey. The Pope's authority stretched over half the peninsula, yet it was fragile, held together by tradition, reverence, and diplomacy more than force. His armies were small, his treasury often strained, but his power was different, not of soldiers or ships, but of legitimacy. Kings might fall, empires might crumble, but the Pope was eternal, or so it seemed. In the heart of Rome, the Vatican glowed like a miniature kingdom. Ambassadors from France, Spain, and Austria gathered in candlelit halls, their coats heavy with medals. Whispers floated through the air, about new alliances, about reform, about the strange energy rising from Paris where people were daring to challenge not just kings but crowns blessed by God. In 1798, those whispers reached Rome. The French Revolution had unleashed a storm, and it was coming for the Papal States. French troops entered Rome under General Berthier. They declared the Pope no longer a ruler, but a prisoner. Pius VI was taken from his palace and sent north into exile. He died far from the Eternal City, an old man weary and broken, the first pope to die a captive in centuries. For a brief moment the Papal States vanished. A Roman Republic was proclaimed, modeled on the ideals of France: freedom, quality, reason. But it was short-lived. When Napoleon rose to power, he played a dangerous game with the Church. He needed its blessing but also its obedience. He restored the Papal States, partly, then seized them again when the Pope refused to bow. In 1809, Pius VII was taken prisoner. He was forced to travel under guard, crossing the Alps in winter, the wind clawing at his robes. In his absence, Rome was annexed into the French Empire. The tricolor flag flew over the city of St. Peter. The Pope's territories were divided into French departments. But when Napoleon fell, the map of Europe was rewritten again, and with it the Papal States returned. Like a ghost that refused to die, they reappeared, smaller yet still sovereign, thanks to the Congress of Vienna in 1815. The great powers of Europe, perhaps out of guilt or fear of chaos, restored the Pope's temporal power. Once more, his coat of arms adorned city gates, and the bells rang in his name. But beneath the surface, change was brewing. Italy was waking. Secret societies met in candlelit basements, whispering of unity and independence. Poets wrote verses about a single, free Italy, not one divided by kings, dukes, and priests. And in those verses, the Papal States became a symbol, not of holiness, but of delay, of the past holding back the future. The young dreamed of revolution, and many of those dreams began in the shadows of the Pope's own cities: Bologna, Ferrara, Perugia. By the 1830s, uprisings broke out across central Italy. They were small, scattered, often crushed, but each left a mark. When Pius IX became Pope in 1846, he was seen as a reformer, a man of vision. He granted amnesty to political prisoners, encouraged modernization, and even allowed a constitution, the Statuto Fondamentale. For a brief, shining moment, he was called the People's Pope. Crowds cheered his name. Patriots dreamed that the Papal States might lead the unification of Italy under his moral banner. It seemed, for once, that faith and liberty could walk hand in hand. But dreams fade quickly in the heat of politics. In 1848, revolutions erupted across Europe. Rome itself rose in rebellion. A Roman Republic was declared again, this time under men like Mazzini and Garibaldi, who wanted a free Italy without kings or priests. Pius IX fled the city in disguise, seeking refuge in Gaeta under Bourbon protection. For a year the Republic held, brave, idealistic, doomed. When French troops arrived in 1849 to protect the Church, they crushed the rebels and restored the Pope's power. But something had changed forever. From that moment on, Pius IX ruled not with the confidence of old popes, but with suspicion and fear. He withdrew from reform, condemned modern ideas, and clung to his temporal authority even as the world around him moved toward nationalism and democracy. The Papal States became a relic, an island of the past surrounded by a sea of change. The question was no longer if they would fall, but when. By the middle of the 19th century, Italy was no longer a land of small kingdoms and quiet valleys. It was a storm-gathering force. The dream of Italia Unita, a single united Italy, was spreading from city to city, whispered by poets, shouted by rebels, and printed in secret newspapers. And in the center of it all stood the Pope's realm, an island of faith surrounded by fire. The Papal States, with their old borders and sacred banners, now seemed almost unreal. Their very existence was a question to a new generation asking, could a land belong to both God and a nation? In 1859, the North ignited first. The Kingdom of Sardinia, under Victor Emmanuel II and his bold Prime Minister, Count Cavour, began its campaign to unify the peninsula. Battles raged in Lombardy and Tuscany. One by one the small duchies fell. And as the movement of unification advanced, All eyes turned toward the papal territories that still divided Italy in half. To reach the south, Italy had to pass through the Pope's land. The question was, who would dare? Cavour was cautious. He understood that war against the Pope would anger Catholic Europe, and especially France, whose Emperor Napoleon III still claimed to be the protector of the Church. Yet Cavour also knew that Italy's heart could never be whole while Rome remained apart. In 1860, a young general, Giuseppe Garibaldi, took the cause into his own hands. With his 1,000 red-shirt volunteers, he sailed to Sicily, conquered the south, and proclaimed himself the liberator of Italy. His campaign burned like a legend through the countryside. Villages that had lived for centuries under papal rule began to wonder, was the time of kings and popes ending? That same year, revolts erupted in the Papal States. In Umbria and the Marche, towns declared for Italy. The papal army tried to resist, but it was small, under-equipped, and divided between foreign volunteers and loyal clerics. In September 1860, Italian forces under General Cialdini invaded. The key battle came at Castelfidardo. It was not long nor glorious. The papal troops fought bravely, led by the French General Lamoricière, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. By the day's end, the Papal States were broken apart. Only Rome remained. Rome, ancient, eternal, sacred, was now all that was left of the Pope's dominion. The rest of central Italy joined the new Kingdom of Italy. In 1861, Victor Emmanuel II was proclaimed King of Italy, though even he hesitated to claim the Eternal City. He sent a letter to Pope Pius IX, offering friendship, and promising to respect his spiritual authority. But the Pope's reply was sorrowful and stern. He would never recognize a kingdom that had taken what was God's. For the next decade, an uneasy peace hung over the land. Rome remained under papal rule, guarded by French troops sent by Napoleon III. The Pope called himself the last sovereign of a divine kingdom. The Italians called Rome their unfinished destiny. Every year, crowds gathered on the outskirts of the city, gazing at its domes from afar, whispering, "Roma o mort," Rome or death. Then came 1870, and fate at last made its move. Far to the north, France went to war with Prussia. Napoleon III withdrew his troops from Rome to defend his empire. The walls of the Eternal City were suddenly unguarded. The Italian government saw its moment. On September 11, 1870, Italian forces marched toward Rome under General Raffaele Cadorna. They surrounded the city and sent a message to the Pope, asking him to surrender peacefully. Pius IX refused. He would not fight, but neither would he yield. He ordered a token resistance, enough to show that the city was taken by force, not given. On the morning of September 20th, Italian artillery opened fire at the Porta Pia, one of Rome's old gates. The walls cracked, smoke rose, and the soldiers entered. It was over by noon. No grand battle, no bloodbath, just a few hours that ended 1,000 years of papal temporal rule. When the smoke cleared, the Italian flag was raised over the Quirinal Palace. Rome belonged to Italy. The Pope had lost half of Italy, and all the world knew it. But in the Vatican, Pius IX sat in silence. He declared himself a prisoner in the Vatican, refusing to step beyond its walls. He would never again walk the streets of the city he once ruled. For him, the world outside had become foreign, almost sinful, a realm that had betrayed God's anointed. The people of Rome, however, cheered. For them, this was the dream fulfilled, the prophecy of unification complete. Italy was won at last, its heart restored. And yet, something strange lingered in the air. As evening fell, the bells of St. Peter's rang not in triumph, but in mourning. The Papal States were gone, but the Church remained. Its power, though no longer carved in borders, began to flow inward, deeper, invisible. Within those few acres of the Vatican, the Pope and his advisors began to build a new idea of sovereignty, not of land, but of spirit. The Vatican became a fortress of faith, a symbol of resistance to modern politics. The loss of land became, paradoxically, a gain of purity. Outside, Italy built railways, ministries, and monuments. Inside, the Pope built silence. Year after year, the Vatican's doors stayed closed. The popes who followed Pius IX would inherit this strange isolation, a spiritual kingdom without territory, a monarchy without borders. The irony was profound. When the Pope ruled half of Italy, his power was questioned. When he ruled none of it, his influence became boundless. Because when you remove walls, sometimes the voice travels farther. And that voice, soft, patient, unyielding, would soon reach the ears of kings and presidents, of soldiers and believers across continents. The Pope had lost his land, but he was about to find the world. After 1870, a strange quiet settled over the Vatican. Rome was alive with energy, streets widening, trams rattling, monuments rising, but inside those high stone walls time had stopped. Pope Pius IX, once the hopeful reformer of a changing world, became the symbol of refusal. He would not speak to the new Italian government, would not leave his small domain, would not acknowledge the king whose palace now stood only a few streets away. The Pope's world had shrunk to a handful of courtyards, chapels, and gardens. Yet, in that confinement, something powerful began to form. A myth, almost. The Prisoner of the Vatican. It was a title that carried both sadness and mystery, and it stirred hearts around the world. Pilgrims came to Rome and gazed at the Vatican walls, whispering prayers for the Holy Father trapped inside. They imagined him surrounded by silence and candles, his faith the only thing keeping him company. And in a way it was true. Pius IX remained within the Apostolic Palace until his death in 1878, the longest reigning pope in history at that time. When he died, Rome was still divided in soul, a capital of a young, proud nation and the sacred seat of a church that would not recognize it. His successor, Leo XIII, inherited not just a church, but a paradox. He ruled no land beyond the Vatican gardens, yet he presided over millions of souls in every country of the world. The question facing him was as old as faith itself. What does power mean when all you have left is belief? Leo XIII was no ordinary pontiff. He was a scholar, a diplomat, a man of both intellect and humility. Where Pius had built walls of defiance, Leo built bridges of words. He could not walk freely through Rome, but his letters, his encyclicals, traveled across oceans. In 1891, he published Rerum Novarum, a groundbreaking document on the rights of workers and the moral responsibilities of employers. It was a new voice from an old throne, gentle yet firm, spiritual yet startlingly modern. The world took notice. Governments, even those that once dismissed the papacy as obsolete, began to listen. The Pope who had no army was suddenly shaping the conscience of industrial society. Factories, labor movements, and political leaders all quoted his words. For the first time, the Vatican became not a political power, but a moral one. And so began a quiet transformation. The Vatican's loss of land became the foundation of its global reach. Without territory to defend, it became freer, lighter in a sense. Diplomats began visiting again, seeking moral guidance instead of treaties. Ambassadors presented credentials not to a king, but to a shepherd. Still, the question of sovereignty hung in the air. What was the Vatican legally? A palace? A sanctuary? Or a nation trapped within another? The Italian government called it a spiritual power. The Vatican called itself a state in exile. Neither side wanted conflict, yet both refused to yield. Meanwhile, outside those thick walls, Rome changed shape. A new boulevard, the Via della Conciliation, was proposed but never built, for it would have symbolically linked the Vatican with Italy, something both sides feared. Instead, the area between St. Peter's Square and the Tiber River remained narrow, crowded, uncertain, much like the relationship itself. By the turn of the 20th century, the popes had learned to live in the shadow of the kingdom. They held ceremonies, issued documents, and tended the archives of a faith that had outlived empires. And as modern Italy expanded, railways stretching north to Milan, factories rising in Turin. The Vatican seemed timeless, untouched, as if existing in another dimension. Visitors described it as stepping into the past. The rooms glowed with candlelight. Cardinals moved like shadows through corridors heavy with incense. The Pope's own study was lined with books and maps of lands no longer his, yet still studied with care, as if each border held a memory, a prayer. When Leo XIII died in 1903, even his critics admired him. He had turned silence into influence. The Vatican had become once again a center of moral authority, not through armies but through ideas. Then came the 20th century, and with it the trembling of the modern world. The First World War erupted in 1914. Nations fell into chaos. Millions died in trenches from France to the Balkans. And the Vatican, small and silent, found itself in a unique position. It belonged to no side. Pope Benedict XV declared neutrality, refusing to take part in the political games of empires. He called for peace. Not victory, not vengeance, just peace. His words, though largely ignored by generals, resonated deeply with the common people, the families who had lost everything. During those years, the Vatican became a place of letters and tears. Refugees sought help. Families sent inquiries for missing soldiers. And in the quiet rooms beneath the Apostolic Palace, clerks and nuns worked day and night, tracing lives lost and found, reuniting those scattered by war. When the armistice finally came in 1918, the world was broken, and the Vatican, though small, stood intact, untouched, almost serene. But the question of its place in Italy still lingered, unresolved after half a century. And into that tension stepped a new power: Benito Mussolini. The fascist regime, rising from the ashes of war, saw the Vatican not as an enemy, but as an opportunity. Italy needed legitimacy. Mussolini, ever the strategist, knew that peace with the Pope could bind the nation's heart as no army ever could. Behind the scenes, secret talks began. 4 months, diplomats and priests met in quiet rooms, drafting documents, measuring each word with care. And then, in 1929, history turned a final, unexpected corner, toward reconciliation. On February 11, 1929, in the Lateran Palace, the Italian government and the Holy See signed the Lateran Treaty. It was more than an agreement. It was a resurrection. At last, the Vatican became a state again. Tiny, just 109 acres, but fully sovereign. A nation of faith, independent within the heart of Italy. The Pope was once again a ruler, but this time of the smallest kingdom on earth. The crowds outside St. Peter's Square cheered as the bells rang in harmony, the bells of Italy and of the Church. The Roman question, unanswered for 59 years, was finally closed. And though the Pope no longer owned half of Italy in that moment, it felt as if he owned something greater, the power to exist beyond time itself. The Lateran Treaty of 1929 changed everything. It was as though 1,000 years of conflict had suddenly exhaled, releasing the tension that had hung over Rome since the fall of the Papal States. At the signing ceremony, beneath frescoed ceilings and the faint scent of incense, 2 men extended their hands across the divide of history. Cardinal Pietro Gasparri, representing Pope Pius XI, and Benito Mussolini, representing King Victor Emmanuel III and the Italian government. The pens glided over parchment, sealing a pact between church and state, between heaven and earth. The document recognized Vatican City as a new sovereign nation, the smallest in the world, yet rich with the weight of eternity. Just 44 hectares of gardens, palaces, and courtyards. But in those few acres lived the heart of an empire of faith stretching across continents. Italy, in turn, received something invaluable: legitimacy, unity, and moral recognition from the oldest institution in the West. And the Pope, after nearly 60 years of isolation, was once again a sovereign ruler, no longer a prisoner, but the master of his own tiny world. When the news spread through Rome, the bells of St. Peter's rang with a sound that carried both joy and melancholy. It was not a return to the past, but the creation of something entirely new. A spiritual kingdom without borders, whose map was drawn not in ink but in devotion. The following months brought an air of quiet wonder. For the first time in living memory, people saw papal flags fluttering again in the Roman wind. Vatican coins were minted, bearing the image of Pius XI. Vatican post office opened. A small army, the Swiss Guards, stood once more as the protectors of the Papal State. Even passports were issued, printed on creamy parchment with seals of gold and red. It was as if the ancient Papal States had returned in miniature, distilled into a single perfect symbol. But beyond the ceremony, the world was changing fast. The 1930s were years of storm and shadow. While the Vatican rejoiced in newfound independence, Europe trembled under the rise of authoritarian regimes. The echo of Mussolini's speeches drifted through the streets of Rome. Across the Alps, a new voice, harsher, colder, rose from Germany. Pope Pius XI, watching from his quiet domain, grew uneasy. He had signed the Lateran Treaty in hope of peace, but now he saw how faith could be twisted by politics. In 1931, he issued an encyclical, Non abbiamo bisogno. We do not need. It was a warning, a subtle rebuke of fascist interference in the spiritual lives of Catholics. He reminded the world that the Church belonged to no government, no ideology, no flag. Its kingdom was not of this earth. And yet, once again, history began to test that truth. As Europe edged toward another war, the Vatican became a watchtower of silence. Within its walls, diplomats and priests whispered news from every capital. The air grew heavy with secrets. Old alliances shifted in the dark. When Pius XI died in 1939, the world outside was already trembling. His successor, Pius XII, stepped into history at its most perilous moment. A scholar and former diplomat, he understood both the power and the fragility of neutrality. Under his watch, the Vatican became a sanctuary, sometimes visible, often hidden, for those caught in the storm of the Second World War. When Rome was occupied by Nazi troops in 1943, the Vatican remained untouched, a neutral island surrounded by terror. Inside those stone walls, refugees hid in attics and cellars. Priests forged documents, smuggled families to safety, and sent coded messages through the Vatican's radio station. Every night, Pius XII walked through the darkened halls, his candle flickering against the marble. He prayed for peace, for the lives he could not save, for the world that seemed to have forgotten mercy. From the window of his private chapel, he could see the distant glow of fires consuming the city beyond the walls, the same city his predecessors had once ruled. And yet, the Vatican endured. When Allied troops entered Rome in June 1944, the bells of St. Peter's rang again. This time not for coronation or treaty, but for survival. The smallest state in the world had remained standing amid the ruin of empires. After the war, the Vatican became something new once more, a moral compass for a weary world. Its power was no longer measured in acres or soldiers, but in influence, in words that reached the hearts of millions. Pope Pius XII guided Europe's reconstruction with calls for peace and reconciliation, though his silence during the Holocaust remained a wound that history would never quite heal. Then, in 1958, came a turning point, the election of Pope John XXII. He was gentle, smiling, and unexpectedly bold. He opened the Vatican's heavy doors and let in the air of the modern age. The world called him Good Pope John, and under him began one of the most transformative moments in modern church history. The Second Vatican Council. From 1962 to 1965, bishops, theologians, and observers from around the world gathered beneath Michelangelo's vast dome to debate the Church's future. They spoke not of power, but of renewal, of facing the modern world with compassion, humility, and openness. The Latin language of ancient rituals gave way to the languages of the people. Old hierarchies softened. Walls, even invisible ones, began to crumble. It was as if the spirit of the Papal States, that long-vanished world of power and boundaries, had finally dissolved completely. The Vatican had been reborn, not as a kingdom of land, but as a voice of conscience. And yet, even as the world celebrated, there was still a quiet irony to it all. For centuries, popes had fought to defend their earthly borders. Now, stripped of them, their influence reached farther than ever before. The Pope no longer owned half of Italy, but in a sense, he owned half the world's attention. The Vatican, once a fortress, had become a bridge between faith and reason, between past and present. The last echo of the Papal States lived only in the archives now, in the soft crackle of old parchment, in the faded red wax seals that once marked decrees of princes and popes. But their story, the story of when the Pope owned half of Italy, still lingered like incense rising from the stones of Rome. Not in power, not in possession, but in memory. When the Papal States faded into history, they did not truly vanish. They transformed. Their borders were erased from maps, but their presence lingered in every church bell, in every cathedral shadow, and in the slow rhythm of Italian life. The towns that once flew the papal flag, Perugia, Bologna, Ravenna, Ferrara, Urbino, and countless others, each carried a trace of that old dominion. In their narrow streets and quiet piazzas, the legacy of the popes was written not just in marble but in the memory of the people. The old palaces of the papal governors, once bustling with clerics and soldiers, became museums or municipal halls. The once feared inquisitors' chambers turned into archives. And in hidden corners of those buildings, faint frescoes still showed the papal tiara, now worn not with pride, but with nostalgia. Italy itself had changed beyond recognition. Trains now cut across the countryside that once divided duchies and bishoprics. Factories rose near the Tiber, where centuries before pilgrims had walked barefoot. The people were no longer subjects of the Pope, nor servants of kings, but citizens of a modern republic. Yet something subtle remained, a spiritual geography that no border could dissolve. Rome still beat to the rhythm of the Vatican's heart. Every decision made behind its ancient walls rippled outward, touching not just Italians, but millions around the world. By the late 20th century, the Vatican's political power had become almost invisible, and yet, paradoxically, more potent than ever. The Pope had no army, no taxes, no land beyond a few city blocks. But his voice reached across continents through radio waves, television screens, and newspapers. When Pope John Paul II stepped out onto the balcony of St. Peter's in 1978, he raised his hands not as a monarch, but as a messenger, the first non-Italian pope in more than 4 centuries. His face, pale, determined, and kind, symbolized a new era. The crowd below him did not chant, "Long live the King." They cried, "Santo, Santo subito," a saint immediately. John Paul II understood what the popes of old could not, that the true borders of his power were drawn not by swords, but by faith. He traveled more than any pope before him, over 100 countries, turning the papal office into a global presence. When he visited Poland, his homeland, in 1979, millions gathered in defiance of communist rule. In that moment, his mere presence became a revolution. No army marched, no cannon fired, and yet, the ground beneath totalitarianism began to tremble. Within a decade, the Iron Curtain would fall. It was as though the ancient might of the Papal States, their political energy, their moral authority, had been reborn in a new form. The Vatican no longer needed borders to shape history. Its map was the human soul. But with power came controversy, as it always had. The Church's silence during past atrocities continued to haunt it. The modern papacy faced questions of transparency, human rights, and scandal. The world, now lit by cameras and instant news, no longer allowed secrets to remain sacred. Still, within those walls, rituals endured. Every morning, the Swiss guards, in their Renaissance uniforms of blue, gold, and crimson, still changed shifts in the courtyard of San Damaso. Their halberds gleamed in the sun, symbols of a past that refused to fade. At noon, the bells of St. Peter's still tolled, as they had for centuries. In the evening, light still spilled through the stained glass, washing the marble floors in hues of ruby and gold. And somewhere in the quiet corridors, Archivists still brushed dust from scrolls written by popes who once commanded kings. The Vatican's secret archives, now renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives, held more than 12 centuries of documents. Letters from emperors and generals, maps of vanished duchies, personal notes of saints and heretics alike. It was there, in dimly lit rooms lined with leather-bound volumes, that the true history of the Papal States still lived, not as myth, not as legend, but as fact. Delicate, undeniable, human. One such document, bound in crimson leather, bore a gold-embossed seal, Bulla Sublimis Deus. It was written in 1537 by Pope Paul III, the same pope who founded the Jesuit order and commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Last Judgment. The bull declared that indigenous peoples of the Americas are truly men, endowed with souls, deserving of liberty and respect. In that fragile parchment lay the paradox of papal history. The same institution that once fought wars and crowned emperors had also produced voices of compassion and reform that transcended their age. From the Renaissance to the 21st century, the papacy remained a mirror, reflecting the contradictions of mankind itself. Ambition and humility, cruelty and mercy, control and faith. And as the years turned, the Vatican adapted yet again. Under Pope Benedict XVI, the Church entered the digital age. For the first time, the papacy reached people through the internet, through Twitter, through images that circled the globe in seconds. Then came his resignation, a decision unseen in 6 centuries, marking the end of an era and the beginning of another. In 2013, white smoke rose once more above the Sistine Chapel. The world looked up waiting, and a new name was spoken: Franciscus. Pope Francis, an Argentine, a Jesuit, a man of the poor. He stepped onto the balcony in simple white, without jewels, without ostentation. He bowed his head and asked the crowd to bless him. It was a gesture small enough to be forgotten, and yet it changed everything. For centuries, the popes had ruled as princes. Now, a pope ruled by humility. And in that moment, it was as if the long arc of papal history had finally come full circle. From the iron authority of Gregory VII to the gentle humanity of Francis. From the conquest of cities to the care of souls. From owning half of Italy to touching the conscience of the world. The Papal States were gone. But the dream that built them, that the spiritual and the temporal could somehow meet, still lived on. The Pope no longer wore a crown of gold, but a ring of fishermen. He rode not in a gilded carriage, but in a small white car. And yet, when he spoke, the world still listened, because history had proven something extraordinary, that even when the Pope stopped ruling the land, he never stopped shaping the world. If you walk through Rome today, the Papal States no longer exist, not on any map, not in any official sense. But the city still breathes them, quietly, like an old dream half remembered. The boundaries that once separated the Pope's territories from the rest of Italy have long disappeared, buried beneath cobblestones, forgotten beneath layers of modern life. Yet, if you pause and listen, you can almost feel their outline, faint as the trace of a vanished river. Take the Via Appia, the ancient Roman road. Once, it was guarded by papal patrols, its milestones marked with the insignia of St. Peter's keys. Now, tourists stroll where soldiers once rode, and the air smells of stone, dust, and sunlight. But beneath their feet lie centuries of sovereignty, the ground once ruled by faith alone. To the north, in Umbria, the towns of Orvieto and Spoleto still carry papal symbols carved above old doorways. The papal arms, the crossed keys, and the triple tiara still appear on fountains, city gates, and forgotten chapels. The people pass by them daily, rarely noticing that these symbols once marked the limits of an empire unlike any other, a kingdom not of conquest, but of divine inheritance. It is strange, isn't it? How the power that once ruled half of Italy could vanish so quietly that even memory became its final cathedral. But history is not a straight line. It bends and folds, turning empires into ruins and ruins into stories. And the story of the Papal States was never about land alone. It was about the tension between heaven and earth, between the authority of God and the ambition of men. Even in the centuries when the popes wore crowns, their hearts were bound by the same conflict. Could one rule both souls and soil? Could one man serve God and govern men? The answer was never simple. For every pope who sought peace, another sought dominion. For every decree of mercy, a war of righteousness followed. The Papal States became the stage on which that eternal struggle played out, not between good and evil, but between faith and power. The roads they built still stretch across the Italian countryside, though the armies that marched upon them are long gone. The fortresses they raised still stand, now softened by vines and sunlight. And the cathedrals, oh, the cathedrals, they still rise like mountains of marble and silence, each one whispering of an age when the world believed that God's kingdom could exist on earth. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to judge that age, to call it superstition or tyranny. But to walk through its remains is to feel something different. Quiet awe, a strange humility before the endurance of belief. Because in those long centuries when the Pope ruled, people found order in chaos. A farmer in Bologna could plow his field knowing that beyond his horizon, Rome's authority watched over him. A monk in Assisi could copy manuscripts beneath the symbol of the keys, believing he served not a man, but eternity. The Papal States were not merely a government. They were a state of mind, a structure of belonging, a web of faith that held millions together. And yet, like all things built by human hands, they carried the seeds of their undoing. Power demanded defense. Faith demanded purity. The two were never easy companions. By the 19th century, the world had changed. Science, revolution, and nationalism had swept across Europe. The people no longer saw the Pope as their temporal lord. They saw him as a relic of another time. And the Papal States, with their outdated administration and stubborn devotion to feudal traditions, could not survive the modern tide. Still, their fall was not a sudden collapse, but a gentle fading, the way twilight slowly steals the light. After 1870, as Italy celebrated unity, the Vatican sank into silence. The Pope behind its walls became a shadow, a symbol of what was lost and what might be regained. For 60 years, the papacy remained in that silence, refusing to acknowledge the new kingdom that surrounded it. It was as though time itself had stopped at the Vatican gates. And then, in 1929, history turned one last page. In the Lateran Palace, the old papal residence, representatives of the Holy See and the Italian government gathered beneath chandeliers that had once shone on monarchs. There, Benito Mussolini and Cardinal Pietro Gasparri signed the Lateran Treaty. With that signature, the Vatican City was born. A new miniature state, less than half a square kilometer in size, yet sovereign and independent. For the first time in 6 decades, the Pope was no longer a prisoner. The Papal States were reborn, not as sprawling provinces, but as a symbolic heart, beating within the body of Italy. The treaty recognized Catholicism as the religion of the state, and in return, the papacy recognized the Kingdom of Italy. It was a delicate peace, political, fragile, necessary. And for many Italians, it felt like a closing circle, a reconciliation between two halves of the same soul. From that moment on, the Vatican would exist as it does today, a whisper of sovereignty surrounded by the noise of modern life. Tourists now walk freely where papal guards once stood. Pilgrims stand in lines that snake through Bernini's colonnades, their voices blending with the hum of cameras and laughter. But somewhere, in the echo of footsteps on stone, you can still sense the old rhythm, the slow heartbeat of the centuries when the Pope owned half of Italy. Because history doesn't vanish. It lingers, in the air, in the architecture, in the eyes of statues that have watched it all. Every dome in Rome carries a memory of papal ambition. Every street corner hides a story of resistance or grace. And every sunset over the Tiber seems to whisper, "All kingdoms pass, but some crowns never fall." The Papal States may have disappeared from the earth, but their idea, that sacred and temporal might coexist however uneasily, still shapes the world we live in. Even nations today struggle with that same balance, between belief and power, between principle and progress. The Pope once held armies, and now he holds audiences. He once ruled fortresses, now he rules hearts. And perhaps, in that transformation, there lies a deeper kind of victory, one that history itself could not erase. If you ever find yourself walking through the old heart of Italy, between Rome, Viterbo, Orvieto, or Ravenna, you may notice something curious. The cities seem to hum quietly beneath their stones. They do not boast like Paris or London, they murmur. Every step you take seems to pass over layers of faith, forgotten oaths and whispered prayers. These were the cities of the Papal States. They may now be part of modern Italy, but their souls were shaped under the seal of the Pope's authority. And though the centuries have changed their rulers, they have not changed their rhythm. In Viterbo, you can still stand before the Papal Palace, its arches rising solemnly against the pale blue sky. It was here, in 1271, that the world's longest papal election took place. For nearly 3 years, the cardinals could not agree on a successor. The city, desperate, locked them inside and even removed the roof to force a decision. That moment, half comic, half tragic, gave birth to a word still used today: conclave, with a key. Stories like that are hidden in every stone of the old papal lands. In Orvieto, the Duomo gleams with mosaics so radiant they seem almost alive. Inside, a small chapel holds the blood-stained corporal of Bologna, a miracle that, legend says, inspired the feast of Corpus Christi. For the people of the Papal States, faith was not distant. It was tangible, physical, present in every breath. The popes who ruled here were not distant monarchs either. They were shepherds and politicians, patrons and warriors. They sent armies and artists alike. They commanded cities, but they also built beauty. Beauty meant to remind people of heaven, even when the earth was harsh. Michelangelo carved his visions under papal commission. Raphael painted saints and scholars under papal patronage. Bernini's fountains, Borromini's curves, the domes of St. Peter's, all were born from the same paradox: spiritual authority expressed through worldly splendor. To understand the Papal States, you must imagine a world where faith was not separate from daily life. It governed not only souls but taxes, roads, and trade. A baker paid his dues to a bishop's steward. A farmer sowed his crops under papal decree. A judge ruled by canon law. And every edict, no matter how mundane, began in nomine domini, in the name of the Lord. It was, in a way, a world where the divine was administrative, and the administrative divine. The sacred inked onto parchment, the spiritual sealed with wax. But time has a way of softening absolutes. The 20th and 21st centuries turned the old papal world into a living museum. Churches became quiet sanctuaries for travelers. Convents became libraries. And the grand roads once patrolled by papal cavalry are now followed by small tour buses carrying pilgrims and dreamers alike. Yet, beneath the surface, something still stirs. It's in the faces of the priests who walk through Trastevere at dusk, their black cassocks brushing the stones. It's in the incense that drifts from a chapel door left slightly open. It's in the silence that falls when the bells of St. John Lateran begin to ring. Because even though the Pope no longer rules Italy, the spiritual gravity of those centuries still pulls gently on the present. Consider how the Vatican today functions. A tiny nation, the smallest in the world, yet recognized by nearly every other country. It has ambassadors, treaties, passports, and postage stamps. Its budget is smaller than many universities, but its moral authority stretches across continents. World leaders still kneel before the same throne that once sent envoys to emperors. Heads of state still gather in the same frescoed rooms where papal secretaries once debated the fate of Christendom. The symbols have changed, but the stage remains. The modern Vatican's global voice, on poverty, migration, peace, and ecology, echoes the same ambition that once built roads and cities across Italy. It no longer builds empires, but it still seeks to guide conscience. And in that quiet continuity, one can hear the faint echo of the Papal States, not as power reclaimed, but as faith reborn in a gentler form. Rome itself seems to understand this duality. Everywhere you look, the sacred and the secular coexist without conflict. A gelato stand stands across from a basilica, Scooters buzz past centuries-old convents. Students laugh on steps where cardinals once plotted diplomacy. The eternal city endures, not because it resists change, but because it absorbs it, turning history into atmosphere. Walk through Campo de' Fiori at dawn, and you'll see the statue of Giordano Bruno, the philosopher burned for heresy by the Roman Inquisition in 1600. He stands now with his hood drawn, a silent challenge to the institution that once condemned him. Yet around him, the square fills with light, with flowers, with voices. Rome remembers both, its triumphs and its mistakes, and somehow it finds peace between them. Even the people who live here seem to carry that serenity. A street vendor crosses himself before opening his stall. A child drops a coin into a church box before running off to play. The sacred and the ordinary flow together, seamless as water over stone. Perhaps that is the final legacy of the Papal States. Not the territories they once held, but the habit of seeing the divine in the everyday. It was a kingdom built on faith, undone by politics, but redeemed by beauty. A paradox that could only exist in Italy, where faith is both a duty and a joy, a discipline and an art. In every sense, the land still remembers. Even the hills, shaped by monasteries and vineyards, seem to sigh with that old rhythm. You can almost imagine the soft rustle of robes, the echo of Latin prayers carried on the wind, the distant hum of pilgrims walking toward Rome, century after century. And if you close your eyes, you might hear it too, not as history but as presence. A voice beneath the noise of the modern world, whispering from the marble and the dust. Here once, the Pope owned half of Italy, but faith owned it all. Even now, in the rhythm of modern Italy, you can feel the pulse of the papal centuries. It lives in the architecture, in the language, in the measured grace with which Italians still move through life, as though some ancient sense of ceremony has never truly faded. Everywhere you go, the remnants of that vanished dominion whisper to you, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet details that most people overlook. A coat of arms carved above a bakery door, long weathered by the sun. A mosaic of St. Peter's keys set into a fountain in Ferrara. A marble tablet in a forgotten courtyard reading, Terra Pontificia, land of the pontiff. Traces of sovereignty turned into decoration. History transformed into art. But it's not just stones that remember. People do too. In their songs, in their customs, in the rhythms of village life, you can still glimpse how deeply the Papal States once shaped their world. In some hill towns, the feast days that began under papal decree continue exactly as they did centuries ago. Candles carried through narrow streets. Choirs singing old hymns in dialects that predate Italy itself. Every gesture, every echo, like a thread tying the present to a vanished age. In the markets, grandmothers still bless the olive oil before pouring it. Children are still baptized in churches whose bells have rung since the days when the Pope ruled both altar and land. And when the Angelus sounds at noon, even the noise of the city seems to pause, for just a heartbeat. For many Italians, that is what it means to live in a place once ruled by faith. To move through a world where the sacred hides in plain sight. But there is something deeper, more fragile, that lingers too. An understanding of impermanence. The people of central Italy have seen kingdoms rise and fall, banners change, rulers come and go. They have learned that power is temporary, but beauty and belief endure. It is why the art of the papal age still moves them, why their cities still glow at dusk as if lit from within. Because beauty, once made, cannot be undone. It outlives even the empires that built it. Walk into the Vatican museums at dawn, before the crowds arrive. You will hear your footsteps echo along marble halls that once carried cardinals, scholars and kings. Light falls across Raphael's frescoes. Scenes of philosophy, theology, poetry. The air smells faintly of dust and oil paint, centuries old. And if you stand long enough, you begin to sense something extraordinary. That this place, built for power, has become a temple of memory instead. The Papal States were many things. Government, fortress, court, but they were also an act of preservation. For more than 1,000 years, while wars burned across Europe, the The popes kept manuscripts, guarded libraries, copied the knowledge of the ancients. They preserved the art of Greece, the philosophy of Rome, the mathematics of the East. In their vaults and scriptoriums, they carried civilization through the storm. Without the Church's protection, flawed though it was, much of that light might have vanished. And so, in a quiet irony, the very institution that resisted progress also protected it. Its walls, built for control, became guardians of continuity. Even now, the Vatican Library holds more than 1 million books, some so old that their pages crumble at the touch of air. It is said that in those halls, time stands still, that to read there is to hear the heartbeat of all who came before. It is this strange duality, faith and preservation, control and creation, that makes the papal legacy unlike any other in human history. Every other empire sought to expand. The Papal States sought to endure. Every other kingdom claimed its right by birth or conquest. The Papal States claimed theirs by divine appointment. And even when that claim collapsed, the faith that underpinned it remained unbroken. In the modern Vatican, the popes no longer speak of owning land. They speak instead of peace, of ecology, of moral unity. They call nations not to kneel, but to listen. And perhaps, in this gentler voice, the world hears the truest echo of what the Papal States once aspired to be. A moral compass in the chaos of power. Rome, too, has changed its rhythm, but it has not forgotten its voice. At night, when the traffic fades and the city settles into silence, the bells of its churches begin to ring, one by one like stars appearing across the sky. Their sound flows through the narrow alleys, over the old bridges, across the Tiber, reaching places where pilgrims once walked barefoot. It is as though the city itself remembers every prayer ever spoken within it. And so the memory of the Papal States is not mourned. It is absorbed, woven into the fabric of daily life, transformed from dominion into atmosphere. The Romans live among ruins, but not as prisoners of the past, as caretakers of it. That may be the truest legacy of the Pope's ancient kingdom. Not its power, but its endurance in the imagination of humankind. The idea that somewhere in the heart of the world, there must be a place where time slows, where the sacred and the worldly can still meet, even if only in silence. That idea still draws millions to St. Peter's Square every year. They come not to see a ruler, but to stand in a place where history still feels alive, where the stones remember the weight of footsteps long gone, where the air itself seems to hum with the ghost of a crown once made of gold, now made of faith. And in that hush, standing beneath the open sky, surrounded by strangers, you can almost understand why the Papal States existed for so long. Not because of power, not because of fear, but because, for centuries, people needed to believe that somewhere, someone carried the link between heaven and earth. The map changed, the world changed, but that need, that longing never did. If you walk through Rome at dawn, before the city fully wakes, you can still sense the ghost of the Papal States in the mist that drifts above the Tiber. The river glimmers faintly under pale light, and on its surface reflections of domes shimmer. St. Peter's, Sant'Angelo, Santa Maria in Trastevere, as though the city's soul is caught between heaven and water. This was once the heart of a realm ruled not by kings or merchants, but by men of faith who believed they carried the keys to eternity. The old bridges remember. Each stone has felt the passage of cardinals in crimson, of guards in bright blue and yellow, of peasants kneeling as the Pope's carriage rolled past. Their hooves echoed across cobblestones that have seen 1,000 processions, 1,000 dawns. Even now, when you touch the cold stone of Ponte Sant'Angelo, you can feel how many centuries it has carried, how many prayers it has heard whispered above the river's quiet murmur. The Papal States were not merely a political territory. They were an idea, that faith could govern the earthly as firmly as it guided the soul. But like all ideas born of conviction, they carried both light and shadow. They offered unity, yet demanded obedience. They promised peace, yet wielded power. And when that balance began to falter, history shifted gently, but irrevocably. By the late 18th century, the world had grown impatient with sacred rule. The Enlightenment had spread like dawn across Europe. People were beginning to believe that truth could be found through reason, not revelation. And reason has never liked to bow. The French Revolution cracked the old order like thunder. Crowns fell, altars trembled, and armies marched across the Alps carrying new flags, not of kings but of nations. In 1798, French troops entered Rome. Pope fled. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the Papal States ceased to exist, not destroyed by war but by an idea. Yet even in exile the papacy waited. And when Napoleon fell, the popes returned. The Papal States rose again, fragile but defiant, like a candle relit after the storm. But the world around them had changed too deeply. Everywhere Italy was stirring. The dream of unification, of one flag from the Alps to Sicily, was growing louder than the bells of St. Peter's. In 1861 that dream took form. The Kingdom of Italy was born. But in Rome, the Pope still reigned, claiming divine right over his remaining lands. A small nation inside a growing one. Faith against the tide of modernity. It was a strange tension, the kind that fills the air like thunder before rain. For 9 long years, Italy and the Papal States lived side by side, one growing stronger, one fading gently. And then, in 1870, it ended. The Italian army entered Rome through a breach in the ancient walls at Porta Pia. No great battle, no heroic speeches. Just the quiet fall of an age. The Papal States were gone. The Pope withdrew into the Vatican and declared himself a prisoner, not of chains but of principle. For nearly 60 years he remained there. The gates closed. The papal territories dissolved into history. Yet from within those walls, the Church began to change. Slowly, cautiously, it turned its gaze inward, from ruling to reflecting, from ownership to influence. And then, in 1929, came the whisper of resolution, the Lateran Treaty, an agreement between Pope Pius XI and Mussolini. The world that once belonged to the Church now became Italy's, but a new country was born. The Vatican City-State, the smallest nation on earth, barely 100 acres. The Pope no longer owned half of Italy, but what he retained was far greater. Sovereignty of the Spirit. It was an ending and a beginning all at once. The Papal States were gone from the maps, but alive in every cathedral, every artwork, every ritual that survived the centuries. Rome had changed, but faith, quiet, persistent, adaptable, had simply taken on a new form. Now, when you stand in St. Peter's Square at sunset, the air hums with that paradox. The marble colonnades curve like open arms, designed by Bernini to embrace all humanity. Light pours through the pillars, gold and gentle, touching faces from every corner of the world. Tourists take photos. Pilgrims pray. Children chase pigeons across ancient stones. And somewhere in that noise there is still silence, the kind that carries history inside it. The bells begin to ring again. Their sound is different now. Less a call to authority, more an echo of continuity. They remind the city not of rule, but of roots. Of how long this place has stood and how much it has seen. Rome, like the papacy, has learned to survive by changing slowly. Every ruin here has been reused, every marble reshaped, every wall built upon the last. The Papal States may have fallen, but the spirit that built them still lingers in every line of the skyline. The domes, the crosses, the fountains that never stop flowing. And perhaps that is the truest meaning of, when the Pope owned half of Italy. It is not about the land. It is about the hold of belief. A quiet, invisible ownership that outlives politics. Because while kings and armies claimed territory, the Church claimed imagination. It drew the boundaries of faith, not geography. And those boundaries, unlike nations, cannot be erased. Sometimes, when the evening air cools and the last light fades from the stones of the Vatican, you can almost imagine hearing it. The faint sound of ancient processions, of distant chants, of sandals brushing over marble floors. The echo of an empire that never conquered, yet lasted 1,000 years. A presence, not of walls, but of memory. Of something eternal hiding beneath the layers of time. The sun sets over Rome, and the city glows as if remembering itself. The last light lingers on the domes and statues, painting them in molten gold before they fade into violet shadow. Above the Tiber, a hush descends. The air cools, the river slows, and even the stones seem to sigh, as though the centuries at last have exhaled. Somewhere, deep within the Vatican walls, a bell tolls. Not for ceremony, not for power, simply because it has always done so. Its sound travels gently through the air, crossing the rooftops, gliding over the cobblestones that once marked the borders of an empire of faith. It echoes through the narrow streets where merchants once paid taxes to the Pope, and where soldiers once saluted his banner. But the bell does not speak of rule anymore, speaks of endurance. It says, "Time moves, but memory remains." And in that tone, deep and resonant, you can almost hear the voice of history whispering, "Remember how it was. But breathe in what is." The Papal States are gone. No border, no army, no throne beneath the sky. And yet, their shadow still drifts across Italy, gentle as smoke. In every church tower that rings at dawn. In every faded fresco where saints still raise their eyes to heaven. In every piece of land once signed Terra Pontificia, where now olive trees grow and children play, unaware of the kingdom beneath their feet. What remains is not power, it is presence. A presence that hums quietly beneath the noise of the modern world, reminding us that once, belief ruled where politics now stand. That there was a time when faith drew maps, when prayers were passports, when the Pope was both shepherd and sovereign. And as strange as it may sound, that age is not entirely gone. Look closely, in the faces of the pilgrims who still walk barefoot to St. Peter's Square, in the nuns crossing the piazza at dawn, in the scholars bent over manuscripts in the Vatican Library. There it still breathes. That same reverence, that same stillness, that same invisible thread connecting human hearts to something greater. When the Pope owned half of Italy, he ruled over souls as much as soil. But now he owns something far subtler, the quiet authority of endurance, a voice that survived revolutions, kings, and empires, and still whispers across the centuries. You can take the land but not the light. And that light remains, soft, unbroken, eternal. It flickers in every candle burning before an altar, every psalm echoing through a cold cathedral, every pilgrim sigh beneath the dome of St. Peter's. A light that history could not conquer. Now imagine you are standing there, in the vast square at night. The crowds have gone. Only the fountains murmur. The cobblestones are damp with the breath of evening. You look up, and there it is. The great dome rising into the dark like a promise. The same dome Michelangelo dreamed into being. The same sky that watched the rise and fall of the papal world. And as you stand there, the centuries fold quietly around you. The line between past and present begins to blur. You can almost see them. The processions, the torches, the banners embroidered with golden keys. The faces of pilgrims who walked from France, from Spain, from faraway kingdoms, all believing that in this one city, heaven brushed against earth. Echo fades, the air grows still, and then nothing, only silence. But it is not an empty silence. It is full of all that remains when time takes everything else away. The hush that follows power, the peace that follows understanding. For history is not gone. It only changes its voice. And if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the heartbeat of the old Papal States. Slow, steady, somewhere beneath the stones of Rome. Close your eyes now. Let the images linger. The golden frescoes, the endless corridors, the soft footsteps on marble. Breathe deeply. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Let the centuries pass through you like wind through an open window. Feel how light the world becomes when you remember that all power fades, but beauty, belief, and memory endure. You are standing, quietly, in the afterglow of history. The Pope no longer owns half of Italy. But the idea, the stillness, the faith, the vision, still owns a piece of the human heart. Now take one more breath. Slowly, gently. Let the sound of the bells drift away. Let the night fold around you. And as you exhale, imagine the city falling into peaceful sleep. The same city that once ruled the world with nothing but faith and time. The Papal States are gone, yes, but Rome still breathes for them. And in that breath, that slow, eternal rhythm, The story continues. Now close your eyes. Feel the calm. Let history rest. The world has changed. But somewhere beneath the layers of stone and memory, the Pope's forgotten kingdom still dreams. Quietly, eternally.